Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen. So today what I want to take a look at, as I mentioned in the teacher message video, I want to take a look at the War of 1812 itself. So if you remember from Friday, or actually, I'm sorry, not Friday, Thursday, that's when it was. We talked about the causes of the War of 1812. And then yesterday, what we did is we reviewed those causes. So what I want to take a look at today is I want to go ahead and talk about the war itself. So just to kind of review, the causes of the War of 1812, in large part, were British involvement in U.S. affairs and things that the U.S. were doing. So U.S. was doing. I'm sorry. So the first thing is the impressment of U.S. sailors, or the forced recruitment, basically, of U.S. sailors to serve in the British Navy. So that was the first part, and the Chesapeake affair is a perfect example of that. And the second thing that really got the United States angry was the fact that the British were arming Tecumseh and other Native Americans in the Mississippi Basin to fight white settlers and fight U.S. citizens and U.S. settlers. I'm sorry, to prevent them from moving into the Mississippi Basin. So those two things, the fact that they armed Native Americans and the fact that they forced U.S. citizens to serve in the British Navy, is going to be the major two reasons that the United States is going to want to declare war on England. And in June of 1812, Congress is going to declare war on England. It'll be an official war, and obviously, as we know, it's known as the War of 1812. There are a couple of important things that I want to make sure that I mention, a couple of very important events that happened during the War of 1812 that I will mention on the next slide. But what I want to focus on and what I want to take a look at is kind of the local connection to the War of 1812. Most of the fighting of the War of 1812 was fought along the U.S.-Canadian border. Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York State, any state really right along the Canadian border. There was a lot of fighting in Buffalo and Niagara Falls, but there was also fighting in St. Lawrence County, where we are today. Now, there is a battle known as the Battle of Ogdensburg, where British and U.S. forces actually fought against each other during the War of 1812. So what I would like you to take a minute to do, guys, before I continue on with the next couple of slides, is I want you to take a look at that local connection and kind of take a look at how the War of 1812 really impacted our area and the area we live in today. So what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and you're going to click on this link here, if you would please, and it might take my computer a minute. So just be patient, guys. So you're going to click on that link, and what is going to happen is this website is going to pop up. Now, there is a reading here that will tell you about the War of 1812 and more specifically, the Battle of Ogdensburg. So I would like you to go ahead and I would like you to read this section. It is pretty short. It shouldn't take you more than about 5 minutes. And if you would like to, I'll leave it up to you. You can watch this video also. So that's going to give you a little information about the War of 1812. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of second break in between what I'm saying now and then continuing on with the rest of the War of 1812. And I want you to take the opportunity to pause this video, read this information, and get an idea of what the Battle of Ogdensburg was like, why it was fought, who was on either side, and all of that. So take a minute, read this over, you can watch the video, and then you can continue this video, and we'll continue talking about the War of 1812. Okay, so now we're going to go back, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the major events that happened during the War of 1812. So there are two major things and two big things that happened during the War of 1812. And oddly enough, those two major things happen away from the main theater of war, away from the US Canadian border. Now, the first thing that happens is Washington, D.C. ends up being burned to the ground. Mainly, this war overall is kind of a stalemate where the United States is going to get the upper hand, and then the British are going to find a way to gain the upper hand. And it's going to move like that back and forth for the entirety of the war. And there is going to be a point where Great Britain is going to be on the offensive and have kind of the stronger position and have kind of everything swinging their way and have it seem like they're winning. And during that time, they are able to march all the way down to Washington, D.C. They are able to force President Madison to evacuate, and they are able to burn Washington, D.C. to the ground. Again, this war is back and forth, fought back and forth. There's really no gains on either side. There really is no clear winner by the end of the War of 1812. Now, the ironic thing and the other kind of major event that happens during the War of 1812 is known as the Battle of New Orleans. And as you may or may not know, New Orleans is a major trading city in the southern part of the United States. It sits at the mouth of the Mississippi River and the Gulf, right on the Gulf of Mexico, and it is a way for manufacturers and merchants to buy and sell goods and move them either further up the Mississippi River into the northern parts of the United States or to ship their goods out to the rest of the world. So New Orleans and the Mississippi River are really important locations in the United States. And the British are actually are going to try to attack New Orleans to really try to hurt merchants and hurt the economy of the United States. Now, Andrew Jackson, who is eventually going to become president, and we'll talk about him later in the next couple of units, Andrew Jackson is going to be the commanding general in New Orleans, and he is actually going to be able to defend the city of New Orleans. And as a result of that defense, he is going to be considered a war hero, and that is eventually going to help him to become president. But Andrew Jackson, during the War of 1812, is able to defend the city of New Orleans and prevent the British from taking the city of New Orleans. Now, the other fun fact about the Battle of New Orleans is that the Battle of New Orleans happened after the treaty ending the War of 1812 was signed. It takes a while for messages to get from one part of the world to the other at this time in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. So it's not like text messages where you can just send a text message where Madison could send a text message to the king and just say, "Hey man, we're looking to end this war, bruh. We'd like to call it a day. What do you think?" And King George can't send back, "Consider it squashed. We're done with the war. It's all over. Let's call it a day." And everybody gets the message instantly. You have to send messengers across the ocean to be able to take and get that message from one country to another. So it takes a long time for the message that peace has been signed in England to get to the United States. So the Battle of New Orleans is actually fought after the war was over and the treaty was signed. And it was kind of understood that the time it took to get that message across, obviously, it had not made it to the United States yet. So it was not seen as the United States trying to restart the war. It was seen as something that happened after the treaty was signed and something that couldn't have been avoided. So the Battle of New Orleans and Washington, D.C. being burned are two major events in the War of 1812. But ultimately, the War of 1812, like I said, is a stalemate. Nobody really gains too much territory. The British are able to have some successes, and the United States is able to have some successes. But ultimately, nobody really gets a clear victory. Now, each country is going to look at it and say that they won the war. but nobody gained or lost anything. So it's really a stalemate. It was really a tie, and nobody won or lost. To end the war, the British and the United States signed what was known as the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, and it ended the war between the British and the United States. And at the end of the war, the British and most of the rest of the world realized that the United States was here to stay. It was not going to be a country that was going to go away or be forgotten in the pages of history. The United States was now here to stay. It was now going to be a permanent country, and nobody was going to be able to really take anything away from the United States. So now that the United States has made it clear that it is, kind of there to stay and not going anywhere, after the War of 1812, the United States can begin to grow as a nation and can begin to view itself as a nation, and that's exactly what is going to happen. So the Treaty of Ghent is kind of the first step to that process. After the Treaty of Ghent and after the War of 1812, the United States is going to do a lot to try to take and really strengthen itself and kind of make itself more permanent, if that makes sense, guys. It's going to take and make some treaties to more clearly define its borders, and more clearly define what makes up the United States and what land the United States owns. The first thing that the United States signed, the first agreement that the United States signed, was with England. England controls Canada. The United States obviously controls the United States. So they had to figure out a way to coexist in areas where Canada and the United States can come into close contact with each other. One of those places is the Great Lakes. Now, you don't want to take and have two militaries on the Great Lakes waiting for tensions to get too huge to the point where you just end up butting heads and starting another war. So what the British and the United States decide to do is they decide to demilitarize the Great Lakes. No military ships are allowed in the Great Lakes or on the Great Lakes, so that you don't lead to a conflict between the United States and Great Britain that is going to lead to war. So that is the first agreement that they make to really try to secure their borders and really kind of secure the United States. The second agreement they make with the British is the Treaty of 1818, which establishes the border once you get past the Great Lakes. Now, if you look at a map, guys, you'll see that the border between Canada and the United States, going from Maine to about Michigan, is going to be based on kind of the outline of the states and kind of just the geographic features that exist from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the western border of Michigan. Once you get past Michigan, you will see that the boundary line between the United States and Canada is one solid straight line. And the reason for that is because past Michigan and to the west of Michigan, the United States and Great Britain agreed to use the 49th degree north latitude line as the border between the United States and Canada. So this Treaty of 1818 sets that border and sets that from Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains. The other thing that the Treaty of 1818 does is it sets an agreement that the United States and England will both occupy the Oregon Territory, and they will both claim ownership of the Oregon Territory. There we go. Sorry, guys. So in the Rush-Bagot Agreement and the Treaty of 1818, the United States is really trying to normalize its relationship with England, and it's trying to really kind of set its borders and kind of set an area that is clearly defined and kind of establish peace so that another war doesn't break out with England. The other thing that the United States tries to do, and the other agreement that the United States signs, is with Spain. And at this point, at this time period in the early 19th century, the United States is going to actually gain possession of Florida. This is when Florida becomes part of the United States. Now, Andrew Jackson is going to invade Florida to chase and kind of attack Native Americans living in Florida. He's going to do that. Spain is going to see this, and there's going to be some tension that is going to arise between Spain and the United States. Spain can see that the United States is looking to expand west. So what it decides to do is it decides to make an agreement with the United States. It will give the United States Florida so long as the United States promises not to continue to expand west. Because if the United States keeps going west, it's going to eventually end up in Spanish-controlled territory. Spain still controls much of Mexico, and what is today the southwestern United States, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, those areas there, Spain still controls. So it wants to prevent the United States from moving into their territory. So what Spain tries to do is they're trying to stop it. So they decide to sign this agreement and give the United States Florida so it will drop their claims to Texas and the rest of the southwestern part of North America, the states, the modern states that Spain still controls. So these are all agreements where the United States is really trying to establish itself and establish its borders and make its borders clear and kind of manage the expansion that it has started under the Louisiana Purchase and everything else. So that is kind of the purpose of these different international issues. It's just fought a war, the War of 1812. It does not want to have to fight another one trying to clearly define the borders of the United States and really establish itself. So what it's going to do is it's going to take and try to create peace agreements in order to establish that peace and create that peace. And ultimately, what the United States is going to get out of this is a much more defined, much larger United States and much more well-defined United States. And it's also going to get a sense of pride and a sense of nationalism where the people of the United States are going to have more pride in their country. And that is going to continue on through the 19th century up to the Civil War. We're also going to see a lot of sectionalism, a lot of pride in the section of the United States that people live in and stuff like that. And we're going to talk about that more when we move on in next class. But I just wanted to take a look at the War of 1812 and kind of the results of the War of 1812, which is these different agreements to really kind of strengthen the United States and more clearly define the borders. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you guys have any questions, if anything like that if any of that was confusing, you guys can always email me during my office hours. If that all makes sense, fantastic. I'm glad to hear it. Please make sure you do your homework and you do the key terms that were assigned, and also make sure you do the check for learning. If you have any questions, again, make sure you reach out to me. Other than that, guys, that's everything I wanted to do for today. I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I will catch you tomorrow.